I believe tertiary education should be free to all Trinidad and Tobago citizens. If you agree, take a seat.
So I think education is a human right, and in that case, I think it should be accessible to all. Why I sat down in terms of the question is not necessarily because I think it should be free given our circumstances with the quality of education, but I think in an ideal Trinidad and Tobago, education should be made available for all Trinidad and Tobago citizens.
I agree with you in that sense, and also that education in itself for a developing country like Trinidad and Tobago where we are now, it could be used as a major tool in order to push our economy forward. If there were initiatives taken to allocate how the education is given free, like directed towards where it's needed in the economy, for sure you can see a lot of benefits from free education to everyone. If, however, we have a situation like what it is now, where you can do basically anything and quality would suffer, that is where it becomes a problem. But me personally, yes, it should be free, and if quality is maintained and people are directed where they are needed, yeah, it'll definitely have a plus towards Trinidad and Tobago's economy.
The rest of you may have your seats.
So the reason I said no is because while I think that tertiary education should be accessible, when you say the word free, it kind of gets me a little on the side of no, because subsidized is something different from free. And I think in our circumstance, and when you actually look and you do research, you need to take into consideration the optimal amount that a government should provide to its country in terms of free education. And when you look at it, you tend to see that the most returns you actually get is right up until that point, right before tertiary education. So in our case, secondary schooling. And after that point, you start to see that the personal benefit to the person who's receiving free education is actually greater than the benefit to society and the government on the whole. So I think that's where we need to kind of find that balance. So in that case, I don't think tertiary education should be free.
To add to your point, what I also see happening, that we all know someone in this room who probably access GATE right now, and they have 100%, but the reality is their family could afford to pay the full tuition. So you need to analyze, okay, there are persons who can't afford at all, whilst there are persons who can afford to pay the tuition.
So I totally agree with you on that point. I do think that education access should be free to an extent, though. I think it should be equitable. Persons who can afford to pay should be able to pay, and also it should take into account accountability. Because a lot of the times you see persons who get education for free, they tend to take it for granted. They tend to bypass courses. They tend to say, okay, well, because it's not coming out of my pocket, I can just do what I want. I can switch my program, and there's no repercussions. So when you look at the term free, what are you really doing in terms of the taxpayers' dollars? Can we afford to give it for free?
I agree with everyone that has spoken so far. I believe that if education is free, then there will not be a great appreciation for the process that we undergo to achieve tertiary education. Should be set by a great, achievable, and attainable benchmark.
And I think we did see that tertiary education was free in that 2010 to 2015 period there when it made GATE 100%. And what I think we saw was that it created a really huge imbalance in the labor market, because while they gave free tertiary education, they did nothing or had no initiative to expand that labor market to actually absorb all of these graduates that were coming out. So now we have problems like brain drain and all of these things.
Yeah. So initially, when I sat down at free tertiary education, it is more in the sense of free in terms of what. So I think for the developmental areas of our country, definitely the education cost should be subsidized so that persons are able to access it, because this is what we need to develop our country. And I agree that definitely if persons cannot afford the education, they should be given first priority. So I think we as students and the government, a country on the whole, we need to determine what free in terms of what. in terms of what it is we need. We need to do a needs assessment into the developmental areas of the country, and and that is where we should be given access to education that is subsidized for sure.
And to go back to what Dana said with that 2010 to 2015 period, so that was when every single program was 100% and you could swap interchangeably and still get 100% funding. That is where we saw tertiary education being free to everyone being a problem, to where no repercussions, people were able to do whatever they wanted. And as an even bigger result too, we saw the quality of everything drop, because if we were to compare like past paper examinations for certain courses from before that time period to where they are right now, you see that they are a lot more difficult and some are even a lot more hands-on. So as I said, like, yes, it must be free, but it must also maintain a standard if it is you want to have proper qualified individuals within the economy to contribute properly.
Yeah. But when we talk about free to who? The taxpayer carries the burden. And at the end of the day, anybody who's spending their money would like to get the best value for their money. Mm-hmm. So if you would like to put out money, you would want it to go to the people who need it the most and who would make the best use of it. Yes. So our education in its sense, like on the whole, is not necessarily free. Yes, the individual would benefit from it, of course, and they would have to put out nothing, but the taxpayer is paying for it. And can we allocate that money elsewhere? Yes, education is a priority, but at what, to what cost?
And that is when I understand the frustration of the population when all of a sudden, we no longer have access to GATE for certain tertiary programs, so postgraduate programs. You can understand the frustration because people are seeing money being wasted in other public enterprises such as WASA. Petrotrin was an example a couple of years ago. Other institutions as well, where we see money being wasted, and we wonder, so if it's so easy to spend there, why then can't you spend on education? So I think it's really like a multifaceted issue where there's no clear-cut answer. But I think we kind of all agree that it has to be steered towards the needs of the country who actually needs the education more so.
Free tertiary education will benefit all society. If you agree, take a seat.
For me personally, I don't know in terms of the free aspect in this question, but I do think tertiary education will be beneficial to all, simply because tertiary education is where you go that step further, where you can become specialized in a specific field, where you actually need individuals who are specialized in research and development in the various fields to kind of move it forward. So I think it's definitely beneficial to all.
This is also an opportunity in which that you could make a valuable contribution to your country, and there is a great demand for researchers and innovators and developers in developing countries, in my opinion.
Yeah, I actually do agree that free tertiary education would benefit all. Should it be free for everybody? That's a different question. And why I say so is because tertiary education actually includes vocational studying as well. Yeah. It also includes certificates. It also includes things that are not mainstream. It's not just the BSc. It's not just the masters. So when you look at that, our society is actually in need of skilled labor. You can't have if our tertiary education system actually is well structured and allows for an optimal amount of people who are both in a vocational track as well as in an academic track, and we have a way to efficiently utilize these people, then free education can actually benefit us a lot.
Yeah. I agree, because I believe that a society or a country that has more of its citizens educated and knowledgeable, you would see the country progressing even more. You would see the population making more educated decisions. So I agree in terms of that. And as you rightfully said, access versus you actually pursuing it, that's two different.
The rest of you may take a seat.
Now, I didn't agree with it because a lot of people, when they pursue tertiary education, some just do it because they have a passion within that field, not necessarily because they want to really do anything with it.
Okay, so the reason I said no is because of the same point I was making in the last question, that after a certain point of funding free education, the return to society is actually diminishing, and at a certain point it's going to become negative. Also, I think in the context of Trinidad, why free tertiary education would not benefit us all is because, one, we don't have the labor market. So what's going to happen is that we're going to have a big brain drain problem, and that wouldn't really benefit the economy. And another thing I want to touch on is the quality of that free education. Yeah, I agree with you, Arianna. We do need that type of innovation out in the economy. We need research, we need development. But when you actually take into consideration what the degree program entails, it's a lot of regurgitation. The degree program itself, well, from what I can see, and most programs, I don't think that it actually opens up that avenue for that kind of critical thinking we need to actually push
I
us
agree
forward.
with you.
Yeah, I actually disagree with you to a certain extent, simply because our society came to a developing point because of free access. So before education was free, people would have had to fund themselves, and with allowing access to education, you would have seen people becoming educated doctors, becoming educated lawyers, and that would have contributed to the development. Is it beyond the point in which it should no longer be free? That's a different question. But I think it has access our society, and it has the potential to I think it has benefited our society, and it has the potential to benefit societies if it's strategically done.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
And
sure.
with that word, strategically.
Yeah.
Because I think what we tend to see is that we don't see that sort of strategic plan,
Yeah.
especially with education here.
I mean, then there's the argument that the government has the various avenues, for example,
Yeah, they do.
trying to remember the name, right?
Yeah,
these
white
institutions.
and all the
There's a
other
lot.
associations that have training programs as
The
well.
thing is that, well, I could say that it's not that they don't have the opportunities. Sometimes our young people, and I could say this because it happens in Miara, they just don't take the opportunity. Whiteham had to close in Miara because didn't have enough persons signing up for the institution. It's a free institution, you get a stipend. So it's that our young people sometimes not applying for these institutions.
But what about the fact that there are institutions now like SBCS and farms that are not accredited? So persons who wish to pursue degrees there cannot access gate funding.
Trinidad and Tobago has the labor market capacity to absorb a high number of highly skilled workers. If you agree, have a seat.
So, I kind of have mixed views on this, but I sat down for no because I think we have the capacity to intake a lot of highly skilled people. What we don't have is the effective management of the labor market to absorb these people, because our labor market is not managed effectively by our government. Our agriculture sector and our energy sectors actually has a lot of excess capacity, but we can't properly, but we can't properly see the effectiveness in the sense that we have university graduates being effectively transitioned into these sectors because of the poor mismanagement of it in the past. And that's what I sat down.
Okay, so I had to sit down while Dana was speaking because I actually do agree with her point where she said that our society does have the capacity, but we just haven't learned to effectively utilize our labor and transition into using them, because a lot of our industries do need to develop and transition to a more efficient and modern way of doing things.
Right, the rest of you may take a seat.
Alright, so the reason why I didn't sit down was because, yes, I agree, in certain sectors we do have the excess capacity. However, in other sectors we don't. And I don't think it's because Trinidad and Tobago in a physical sense is limited, but I think we have the potential to develop our labor market if we have the right governance to do so. So for example, simple things as the ease of doing business, right? That is a very big obstacle in a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation, activities, right? Because the ease of doing business, because it's so difficult to like open up a business bank account and all of these things, right? It would be a hindrance in that sense, right? So I think it's about the potential of our labor market versus rather than us not having it at all. So I think it has to grow, is what I'm saying.
To add to what Ruqayyah said about the ease of doing business ranks, preventing, innovation and whatnot. To me, a lot of things within Trinidad, businesses and whatnot, are all repetitive businesses. So you see a lot of people opening bars, clothing shops, things that are already there with nothing new. And if you have innovation, it's always very small things with things that already exist. It isn't like a brand new product or invention that could contribute positively, not just by creating a whole new industry, but could be exported and whatnot. So that's where that problem lies in there with me. Like, too much repetition, which could go back to how our education is basically regurgitation. It could be a linkage with that as well, but that's my main problems with it.
The reason why I disagreed is because I believe we need a lot of reform and transformation in order to allow different sectors to allow for innovation. So I'm going to use the example of the public sector and, for example, local government in itself. Right now, in order for local government to effectively execute its mandate, it needs to hire skilled workers, but the current structure does not allow that. So we need more engineers, we actually need social workers, we actually need all of that to execute the mandate, but the structure does not allow. So that's why I disagree.
And I think, to add to that point as well, for example, let us say, we have 500 doctors graduating every single year. Now, we know in our health sector that we need these doctors, we need the nurses, because we see what's happening in our public healthcare system. But let us say we were to occupy at 100% capacity, but we were still graduating 500 doctors every year. Yeah. Where would these doctors go? Because our labor market cannot absorb that. Are we going to build a hospital in the sea where we're going to be, what I mean? So if it is we are operating at full capacity, which can happen once we have, public health reform, then what are we going to do with all of these people that are graduating? I think the reality is Trinidad and Tobago is a small country and we can't, tell ourselves that we are as large as the United States or as Canada or some of these other countries that are so large that they have the capacity to, develop so many things that, they may never run into a problem like this. So what we need to do, I really think, is we need to we need to see where we have excess capacity currently, which is what Dana said, our non-booming tradable sector, so that we can see our excess capacity there and, really capitalize on that and do research and do the reform that's needed so that we can see where Trinidad and Tobago really operates at 100% capacity, so then we would know, all right, what is our actual problem.
What about even looking at areas in which there are shortages? Like, for instance, coroners. Trinidad has one of the highest crime rates in the world, and on top of the people getting murdered or killed, there are persons that die every day from natural causes. We need to look at these things, because I believe that is a part of the problem. And once you identify areas with shortages, we can look at ways in which to incentivize persons to pursue a career in these fields.
Yeah.
The GATE program is efficient. If you agree, take a seat.
Alright, so I believe that the GATE program, even though they restructure, that's to cut back how much money they spend, the fact of the matter is people are still cheating the system. As a result, it is not efficient. You are literally reformed and restructured to cut back spending, and people who could actually pay are still benefiting. So unless you strengthen your means test, it's not going to be efficient.
To add to your point, Chrisette, I actually saw recently that in a budget survey from way back in 2008-2009, it showed that the people who actually accessed GATE came from high-income households, the majority of them. And the people that actually need it, you would tend to find that they're not in the programs that GATE is offered to.
You know, we had the restructuring where you change income brackets with this fund and whatnot. People were already in problems with their applications being cancelled without them knowing, with funding being late and people's grades being held back because of it, with means that's taking forever to really process. And I personally think now that you have the restructuring and it means that's mandatory for every single person if you want funding, the inefficient dealings with the paperwork, it was never tackled.
Right.
And because it was inefficient with paperwork, adding more paperwork on top of what was already there, just going to make the situation even worse.
Okay, so we know with the means test in terms on the side of GATE, in terms of the paperwork, and not strengthening the means test, but on the side of the students and the persons seeking the services of GATE, I know for a fact that I know persons whose parents would say, well, you could qualify, just take it because it's free. You know, so just take GATE when you actually don't need it, right? And then when you look at the other expenses with school, for example, you will see some students accessing GATE, but when you look at the cost of their apartment, may be very high. When you look at the devices that they use, so then you would wonder how is it that you can afford all of these things, but you can't afford your tuition when your tuition is sometimes cheaper than the price of your laptop, than the price of your phone, than the price of your apartment, right? So it is all of these things where it really shows you that the persons who GATE is meant for are not the ones who are benefiting from it in majority of the times, and that is the biggest problem with GATE. So what they need to do is really tailor it towards who needs it, which is what they did with the revised scholarship program, where they cut down the amount of scholarships and they said that they would have a grant, an education grant, given to those who actually need it. Because we know that there are people in Trinidad and Tobago, we're not a very rich nation, so we know that there are people who need the funding. So in a sense like that, I think GATE should really be for those who need it, because the way it's running right now, it's really inefficient.
I agree. I think that GATE's administrative issues do compound its allocative inefficiencies. As Ruqayyah just said, like, I don't want to repeat all of it, but the fact of the matter is there are people who find ways of beating the system. And without actually having the proper mechanisms in place to stop it and to streamline them appropriately, we will reach nowhere and the program will always run inefficiently.
To add to what Dietrich said, while I have not been a recipient of GATE funding, I do have friends that have encountered endless struggles. There are those that have been, their applications have been cancelled. They also have poor communication with representatives of the GATE department.
I think the reason why some students are cancelled is because they don't fill out enough information pertaining to your household income. Now, the persons who usually complain, and I was on the committee of the Office of the Vice President that deals with student complaints, and it's always because they are missing a very pertinent document, or they use a document from last year. So you need to constantly update your documents. So I wouldn't solely blame the GATE administration. This is their attempt to sort of streamline the students and make sure they're not being cheated, but I still agree that they need to strengthen the system.
Another problem with the GATE program is the means test. From speaking to my friends, you know, once your household income is under 10,000 a month, you qualify for 100% GATE funding. But when you look at those that receive 50% or even 75%, a person whose household income is 10,500 and a person whose household income is 29,000, they pay the same amount. And that is one of the problems.
You know, in economics, we know of this thing called the free rider problem, right? And that is something to an extent that you can see with, you know, recipients of the GATE program. So when we look at our peers and our classmates, right, and we look at the kind of culture on the university, right, being able to access free education gives, sometimes you would see persons not attending their classes as regularly. Had you been paying for that, you were going to class on time every single day, sending every assignment, you were not failing anything, right? So GATE, in a sense, because it has such low accountability, what you do after the degree, it doesn't hold students accountable to the services that they're getting from GATE. Because let's be real, Trinidad and Tobago is very fortunate to have GATE in the first place, because there are very few countries around the world who gives this kind of assistance to students. So we take advantage of that, and GATE program is not holding us accountable to the services that we receive, and that is why you see persons just squandering the program, because let's be real, some people, they will switch programs multiple times, right?
And
They will
receive
fail,
funding.
and they will receive funding, and they will fail courses and have to repeat and just simply not take it seriously.
Another thing I just want to backpedal on is the point that we made first when we said that, like the people who are accessing gates is not the people who really need gates. And what we tend to see is that the people who come from lower income households, because of cultural practices and because just of their way of life, university is not something they usually go into, so they tend to go into more vocational skills.
Yes.
And these are the things that I don't think GATE covers.
Right, yeah.
So-
Yeah.
Just one more point. As someone from South Trinidad, I am 100% thankful for GATE because the funding for, as you said, rent, food, you have to travel from your apartment. That by itself is more than that 6,000 to allocation for every semester.
Trinidad should adopt a student loan regime. If you agree, take a seat.
So I actually somewhat agree with this prompt because the cost of our education in Trinidad and Tobago is relatively affordable. And with providing a help loan, you would attach some sort of accountability to the person receiving the education, and they would be more inclined to take their academic success seriously. That's one thing I think a help loan would do. Also, in providing a help loan, persons who actually go to banks, they would be no longer disadvantaged because if the help loan is administered through our government, they can offer it at lower interest rates, which would mean that the student themselves would benefit instead of having to figure out how they're going to repay the loan after. Yes, student debt is something that should be considered, but at the end of the day, education to me is a privilege after secondary school. It is something that we all benefit from, but you have to take some sort of initiative and accountability when it comes to your funding for your education.
The rest of you may have a seat.
So whilst I do think Renee's point is very valid in the sense of accountability, I can agree with that. However, I feel because of the way our economy is right now, when it comes to young people with youth unemployment, we have just young people, the opportunities for young people, right? I think an additional student loan on top of that could be, strenuous. And I mean, the cost of UE degrees might be affordable, but we have other tertiary institutions as well, may not be so affordable. And then, so a government help loan, which we currently have right now and is administered through the commercial banks, that obviously can help because I think one of the requirements is that you only have to repay when you are employed, right? But for example, if it is we set up a regime where it's not monitored effectively by the government, and we know that is something that we generally suffer from. So if the private sector was to take that upon themselves, then you would literally have so many different types of loans with different requirements that may be very harsh, because we know, for example, if you go to purchase a house, if you go to TTMF, the interest rate is way lower than if you go to a Royal Bank or a Scotiabank or a First Citizens Bank, right? So in that sense, I think it can add a lot of pressure on young people when you already have to get a good credit rating to get a vehicle, to get a house, and a student loan. I just think that's a lot of debt in general when our youth unemployment rate is so high.
I agree with what you said, and I also I really like your points. But for me, the issue is the pressure, as you said, that it would add to youth. And I think a student loan isn't the avenue we should take. I think, so for example, just building off the help loan that we have, I think it should be done in such a way that after you work for, if your paycheck is over a certain amount, then you begin to repay. Because you can start to work and we know entry-level jobs aren't much, so it will still add that pressure. So if they can probably put a threshold or a limit on the amount that you have to be earning to be able to start to repay, I think that will probably work in some way.
Okay, so the current criteria of our existing help loan has to do with the acceptance into a tertiary education program. I can't remember seeing anything specifying a credit rating, but what I do think is when you consider what a help loan is, it wouldn't operate in a silo, it wouldn't operate within itself. There would also be scholarship programs. Within the university itself, there are scholarships. Within the government, there are scholarships. There are also grants or funds that different organizations give, like Massey and other corporate sponsors. So to me, the loan would be for the person who has worked hard, yes, and maybe, let's say you haven't fully met the requirements to get a scholarship per se, or to get any sort of free funding. You get into your program, but it's up to you at that stage to work and show yourself, or prove yourself, I should say, in order for you to apply for other opportunities, because I think university has a lot of opportunities.
I get that, and however, this is the reason why I sat down in the very first question about free education, because I feel like we shouldn't have to fight up so much to be able to access a degree. Go buy Massey, run around to this company and try to get funding from this bank and qualify and all these things. Because I see education as a human right. I mean, it's one of our, quality education is one of our sustainable development goals.
Yeah.
And I feel as though it shouldn't be made so difficult. So if we can have a system where they can work in cohesion, that would be perfect. But we can see what happens with that. And the second point I want to make is, right, if it is you are telling someone to go and take out a loan to attend a university, then you want to make sure you are getting a quality education. And especially with COVID-19 in this online setting, quality education is completely different to what quality education was just 1 year ago. So now it's not even about student opportunities at the university, but it's about your learning experience and the content that you're learning. Dana mentioned in a previous question about regurgitation. Why would I take out a loan for, let's say, $400,000 to pay for a degree, a medical degree, a law degree, or how much ever it costs, when I know that I am not going to get a fruitful quality education from this experience? I might actually prefer to take out a loan of the same quality and go to a university abroad and do that. So that's why we get that brain drain, because people are not going to take out money for something that isn't quality, because we know basic economics utility. These are your microeconomic choices. You need to be able to derive some utility from what it is you're paying for.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the important thing is really bridging the gap, because you don't want to put stress on somebody, but at the same time, you can't fully offer everything free because it's not sustainable.
Yeah.